Hello, this is Sandy Nadelson, and this is week 10 recording for legal ethical issues in research. And this is actually a topic that I really enjoy. It's a whole lot better than reliability and validity. Not that those aren't important. I worked as a legal nurse consultant for a few years, and so I have had a lot of experience in legal ethical issues and worked a lot with the Institutional Review Board. It's also called IRBs. And so believe it or not, this is something that I find very interesting, and I'll be quite honest, not everyone does, but when you find out more about it, it becomes more real, I think, and more helpful. So in terms of learning, today I'm going to talk about the historical background and about vulnerable populations in research, describe the nurse's role as patient advocate, identify essential elements of an informed consent form, and describe the IRB role, and then critique ethical aspects of research. In terms of critiquing research studies, there is some minimal information given in the studies that needs to be there, and it doesn't mean the safeguards aren't taken if it's not fully reported, but I think it's important for somewhere in the study that the researchers say that an institutional review board has reviewed it and approved the study. Some journals now are requiring that before an article can be published that the author either produce IRB paperwork that says it was approved or at least state that it was to the reviewers. And so you may not find that, but the implication is that every study that is published should have gone through an IRB board if it had subjects in it. There are a few things that don't necessarily have to have a consent form associated, but even a completely exempt should at least have some sort of review and some sort of backup. Reviewer considerations in terms of what needs to happen. There needs to be a review of what are the risks and what are the benefits to people who are involved. Is there a vulnerable group? Is that group being protected? In issues of qualitative research, it's often more difficult to make sure the person has anonymity, and to do that, oftentimes fictitious names are used and different information will be held or changed. For example, rather than saying it was a female nurse manager, they might say a male nurse manager, or change the subject's identity a little bit. For any study, a patient says, I want to participate day one, they can change their mind at any point. Even if the study's been going on for 20 years and you're 19, they say, I'm not going to do it. They have the right to do that. In terms of, there's a lot of training. The National Institute of Health has a training that if you're going to do research, you actually have to do. The IRBs require it. It takes about 2 hours or more, depends on how fast you read, and then after you're done you get a certificate. So if you have some extra time and want to do that, I recommend it. If you're planning on going into research, it's something that you will need to do. It needs to be redone, depending on the institution, usually at least every 2 years. So it's something that if you are going to go to research, you'll get well acquainted for. And the good thing is it has some great information about research. It does go over some history. Some of the, there's been atrocities in research that's been done, poorly done research that actually has hurt people for many years. From 1939 to 1945, the Nazis performed a variety of surgeries and mutilations and just horrible, treating people more like animals than humans. And from that came out the Nuremberg Code after World War II ended, which suggested that all research must have voluntary participants. It must be good for society and the good of society, and any risks that are occurred by the subject would have to be balanced with the benefits. And they need also to be, the subjects need to know about those risks. And researchers need to be qualified to do research, and not just anyone be doing that. In the 1970s, there was a thing called the Hugh Report and the Hugh Regulations, which mandated that institutions have an institutional review board, which is just called an IRB, and they study what's going on and make sure that the research that's going to be conducted is within the standards and protects human subjects. There's also a thing called the National Research Act, which also provided protection through HUE, and then the Belmont report, which identified 3 ethical principles. And those ethical principles include that we need to have respect for the person. They have the right to self-determination, in other words, decide, am I going to be in the study or not, and what part of the study might I be in. And they have a right to autonomy and to be protected. Beneficence, that there be good coming out of the research, that individuals are protected, and if there is any kind of harm, that it be minimal, the person's aware of it, and hopefully in some way it's compensated for it. In terms of harm, it's difficult. Is it harmful to draw blood from a person? Yeah, in a way it is. But if a study needs to have blood drawn in order to find something important in terms of treatment, maybe for HIV or heart disease or whatever, is that harm justified? And that's what's really important. And justice, that we treat people fairly and we don't burden any particular individual or group of individuals. So let's look at an example. Which right was being violated? A research participant enrolls in a study at his physician's office and then finds out he must take off work and drive 36 miles to participate. He wants to drop out but is afraid that his medical care will be compromised by doing so. In that, let's go back. In terms of what's happening, the person is feeling that they're obliged to be part of that and that they'll be treated badly if they don't. So there is not being respect for self-determination. They're potentially putting the person at harm. If you have to take it off work, you could risk being fired or having other problems, and also the expense. So a variety of issues with that. Another one, a researcher attends a daycare center and tests children for hand-eye coordination. This is unrelated to the daycare program and no results are given to the teachers or parents. Permission was obtained from the owner of the daycare only. Once again, self-determination and autonomy, they're not being told or not getting any benefit of that. So there's some issues with that study. Another one, married couples give consent to participate in a research study about, quote, how couples support each other. However, as part of the study, the spouses are interviewed separately and given false information about their spouse. When the couple is reunited, the researchers measure how they deal with the information. Once again, they are being basically lied to about the study and potentially brought under harm in terms of the study might cause them to have marital conflict. And is that good, worth that risk? If certainly they didn't approve and didn't know about it, I would say not. So other historical events to be aware of. In the 1980s, there was a Code of Federal Regulations which kind of gave some criteria to IRB and said, what does an informed consent need to have and how do you do that? In the 1990s, the HIPAA, probably heard that way more than you want to, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act really made some specific rules about privacy and confidentiality of information within healthcare. If you're doing research in terms of education, there still are some rules that relate to it, but definitely with patients, HIPAA is a big deal. And the National Institute of Health talked about procedures for addressing scientific misconduct and what to do. The American Nurses Association, ANA, came out in 2001 with some guidelines about human rights and said that certainly everyone has a right for self-determination. They have a right to privacy and dignity, anonymity and confidentiality, the right to fair treatment, and the right to protect from discomfort and harm. And nurses need to be aware of that and protect that. So in your small group, I hope that you will take a look at least one of these studies that's listed from 1 to 5 and then talk about it. Also analyze possible regulations related to any of the following: Belmont, the Code of Federal Regulation, the ANA guidelines. The Tuskegee syphilis study gets brought up quite a bit, and I've read about it again and again, and I just was kind of like, how did this happen? What was going on in these people's minds? And I just fairly recently, watched a movie which helped me understand the whole process and really brought the whole experience to life for me. And I highly, highly recommend that you either rent or get it from online. YouTube has this movie called Miss Evers' Boys. So M-I-S-S, Evers, E-V-E-R, apostrophe S, and then Boys. It is about the nurse, the main nurse in the Tuskegee syphilis study, and what she was thinking, what she was going through throughout the experience. It also gives a good picture of what the men who were involved in the research went through and what was going on. And it was amazing to watch that film. You don't feel the same afterwards, and you get a real sense of research gone wrong and how awful people could be. But the nurse herself didn't mean to be awful. She thought she was helping. She thought she was doing a good thing, and it identifies, some of the reasons that we need IRBs and we need these regulations so that people don't get drawn into these research experiments and then continue on in obviously a real strong negative way. So once again, that's Miss Evers' Boys. I think it comes in about 8 different parts, and it's definitely worth watching. Talking about what needs to be protected for patients, going on to HIPAA, things like name, addresses, email addresses, birth dates, discharge dates, telephone numbers, fax, Social Security for sure, and the unique identity of a person or characteristic, for example, whether they're HIV positive, whether they have a family history of a genetically transmitted disease, would be something that would really need to be protected. In terms of protecting vulnerable groups, there's specific groups that are considered to be vulnerable. Elderly children, pregnant women, fetuses, mentally ill people, people with physical disabilities, prisoners, persons with AIDS, and students. And just because people are on this list doesn't mean we cannot do research on these, but we have to be extra careful when we're doing research in any of these areas to make sure that we are protecting people's needs. In terms of potential violations, there is concern in terms of, are we protecting women, particularly if they might be pregnant? We don't want to coerce people in prison, so usually prison populations are pretty much out for research. For many years, prisoners were used like guinea pigs, and it's really an issue. In terms of children, there is a term called assent. As kids get older, they have to agree, and not only their parents, but the children, to what's happening and be made aware of the research they're being involved in. Language barriers and cross-cultural issues need to be considered, and need to be aware that the person understands what is going on, that the consent form's in their language and easily understood. Talk about the informed consent. The informed consent needs to say what is going to be happening, who is doing that research, what research outcomes in terms of risk and benefits there are, and then to make sure that the person is not being coerced or somehow forced into the research is very important. And so there's always a statement, you can go out any time if there's any questions, and they have the phone number and the contact people of IRB, and real specific. In terms of language, if it's for adults, the 8th grade level is the highest we can use. We need to make sure that we're writing to a level where everyone can understand. The prospect of the subject, in terms of what's the time involved, what's the risk involved, needs to be very specific. Research must report any undue effects. An example, the nurse health study, they stopped part of the study on the use of the menopause hormone replacement due to increased risk of breast cancer. So they realized as they were went along, hey, there's a problem here. We have to stop for ethical reasons. And so sometimes research happens that way, or stopped that way. Subjects cannot be asked to release investigators from liability for negligence. That is something that the researcher needs to bear in mind. Consent forms for procedures, they need to be signed and dated. Researcher usually also signs a copy is given to the person, and the researcher themselves give a file copy. There are some forms that people don't have to sign. For example, I've done some research on students, I'm talking about students in caring, that the only connection to the results would be a signed consent form. So rather the IRB at times, if that's the only place their name would be down, would be on consent forms, say you don't have to have a consent, and it's applied in consent. If you fill out this form, you are saying that you consent to doing the study. You don't have to, but many times now there may not be a signed consent form, and that might likely be the self-administered survey. And then also retrospective chart audits. Many hospitals will allow researchers to go through charts if it's approved by IRB and the information gathered still protects the person's rights. Written consent forms must have the purpose of the research procedure, description of benefits and discomforts, an alternative or treatment to injury. So if it's about a new drug, it's like you do not need to take this drug. You could take the old drug. You don't have to participate if you don't want to. Assures anonymity and confidentiality. It says that this is a voluntary participation. If there is any payment that's going to be involved, that has to be written out and how that's going to happen. The assurance that subjects cannot be dropped without penalty, and then who to contact with questions, usually the IRB and also the chief investigators in terms of researchers' names and information's there. IRBs are boards that review research. They follow the federal regulations. They usually have a minimum of 5 people, various backgrounds. Many times the hospital ones, they're hospital employees, doctors. Usually there's a community member, oftentimes clergy or some person from an outside agency that relates to spiritual concerns of people. So it's an interesting group of people. The purpose is to assess the ethical standards and make sure they're met, and to protect the rights of the human subjects, to make sure that they don't have too much risk, they're protecting their personal rights and dignity, and that we're protecting vulnerable people. A nurse's role. If you can be a member of the IRB in the facility you work, you can volunteer to do that. Oftentimes they're looking for people who are wanting to participate. Then you would review the research projects that come in, the groups meet and give feedback of whether it's okay or not. In addition, if you are doing research that you may need, and hopefully you would, submit to the IRB your procedure and your protocol for your research. If another role of the nurse is, if you see some research being done that is not being conducted well, you have a right and a responsibility to report that to the IRB and to let people know that research is done that is not meeting the standards. Changing focus now in terms of critiquing your research, you want to look at the study that you're going to be reviewing and say, does it say anything about an IRB? Was there informed consent? Were vulnerable subjects included? Were subjects protected from physical or emotional harm? And what were the risks and benefits? And what did that seem reasonable to you? And was the privacy of subjects protected? You will rarely see all these questions answered as you are writing your paper or reading the paper. So if you don't see these questions answered, you can say that that information was not provided, and that would be, oh, that's fine. We understand that not every research paper is going to have all that information. Sometimes it's quite vague in terms of IRB. So that's it for this week, and I think this is actually the last PowerPoint altogether for the semester. So it's been fun. Have a good one, and let me know if you have questions. Bye now.